Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Deb Swanson and I'm the host for this session. And this session sounds like it's going to be a wonderful one. It's entitled, Can We Be Friends with Our Students? It's being facilitated by two of our top faculty who teach in Ashford's College of Health and Human Services and Science. And it's led by Dr. Yolanda Harper and Dr. Trevor Belcher. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Deb. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Yolanda Harper, and thank you for joining us today. And so we're going to talk about this topic of can we be friends with our students? But we really want to hear from you as well. So do, as we go along the way, share your thoughts and comments in the chat. And at the end, we'll also open it up for people to share by the mic as well. So we'll go ahead and get started with the first question. Well, this is, our session overview. So these are the topics that we're going to cover as time permits. And we'll get started with the first question. So do you interact socially with students outside of the academic context? And if you'd let us know in the chat, it's a basic yes or no. Pamela says sometimes, a lot of sometimes. Alice says no. Usually no, that's interesting. So for the most part, I don't, when appropriate, that's interesting. We'll definitely want to hear more about that a little bit later, Janine. Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. And do those who haven't responded, feel free to continue to respond. And think about this question. I noticed there were more no's than other responses. I didn't see any definitively yes at this point. Why or why not in this? And I noticed Stephanie said not until they're alumni, which is an interesting thought. Because what happens if they become graduate students? Do the rules change? And then we want you to think and share about what guidelines do you use in determining how to engage students socially. Trevor, you want to answer for yourself at this point?
Sure. Thanks, Yolanda. So like most people on here, I mean, I think sometimes for me, and I'd love to hear more from Pamela, from any of those who said sometimes, and from Janie about when appropriate, feel free to, type in the chat box or just come on the mic either way. For me, I do interact with them on, LinkedIn or via the psychology club or other clubs like that. I've had some students who've actually sent Facebook requests to me because they'll see me interact on the college Facebook page. And so the thing for me is, am I teaching those students? What's the relationship there? So, and the same for phone calls. Like I'll get people who students specifically, when I was teaching more, that would want to ask questions about the class. And I was always willing to follow up with a phone call, have a conversation, that kind of thing. But I know others have strong feelings about those. So that's kind of where I'm at.
I'm glad you mentioned phone calls, Trevor, because yes, we make our phones available for students to call us, expecting them to call about course-related content. But students are humans just like the rest of us. So how do you handle when the conversation bleeds over from the academic to the personal? Or do you ever have that experience?
Alice brings up a good point in the chat, Yolanda. She said, is it more about the content we talk about around social interaction? Is it more about the content when we talk about social interaction?
I think that's a great point, and I would think so. Okay, so let's talk a little bit or Trevor, you want to take the lead on this one? I'm sorry.
Sure. And I'll just say this to Alice's question. So Allison, like I had a student who she had some questions about a class, and I remember reaching out. She wanted to have a phone appointment, and I reached out, and I was just helping. It was all about the class, and then all of a sudden I noticed I got a Facebook friend request and a LinkedIn friend request. And I kind of hit pause, right? I didn't respond. I just let it sit for a couple of days. And then I started getting these more, emails and messages through those. And so that really gave me pause. And so, which brings up kind of a question that, can a student see things, in my mind, the students perceive interactions differently than maybe we do. Like I was just keeping it focused on the content at that particular time, but this person had no one else in their life really helping or supporting them. And so I was afraid they were interpreting that support, in a different manner than I was intending. So and that brings up a question here. Speaking from the perspective of your professional discipline, what are the risks and or benefits associated with being friends with students? And I kind of touched on a little bit of that, but.
Yeah, and we understand that every discipline is different. So we're hoping that we have a large array of disciplines represented here today who will share some about from your perspective. My degree is in psychology, clinical psychology, and so we have very strict rules about keeping boundaries as clear as possible with students or anyone that you have some type of supervisory type of relationship with, or certainly a therapeutic relationship. But even with students, we're supposed to be pretty clear about the boundaries. Yes, that's a distinction I'm glad you made, Alice, about I'm not a friend, but I will mentor. Definitely, I think all of us, I know I do, a lot of mentoring. And I think that's part of our role here is to be a mentor, because there are certain skills that can be developed through mentoring kind of outside of the academic or formal classroom context where you have a little more time to interact with students. And I think that's very appropriate. And I think it enhances our goals academically when we're willing to do that.
I agree. And I think we just want to be clear, that we are serving in that capacity. And like in a profession such as psychology or counseling or something like that, be careful that the student doesn't try to pull us into a therapeutic relationship, which Yolanda and I've talked about in other presentations before. And then if the student starts to perceive things differently or try to move it in that direction, be willing to hit the pause on that and, bring in as necessary or redirect as necessary. So,
yeah, so I noticed Stephanie mentioned a potential risk would be perceived favoritism, and that's very real. It happens in brick and mortar classrooms and certainly can happen through the online environment. Students start sharing with other classmates about interactions they have with us that seem beyond what would be expected academically.
Great point, Wendy. I agree. Boundaries are important for any kind of supervisory relationship. Yep. All right, next slide, Yolanda.
Okay, and many of us, probably have stories or heard stories when we were undergraduates or graduates about the professor who goes off and marries his student or dates her, or the professor that's known to run through the freshman class of students. And so we certainly realize that those relationships happen. And so that's why we're having a conversation. Now, the two of us who are leading this session, we're pretty strict. We're quite strict on our boundaries. And so those kind of risks aren't going to happen for us, but we do know they happen out there. And so we may have someone on the chat who has had a relationship with a faculty member or a student, and we're just having a conversation.
And Alice puts a question in the chat, Yolanda. So do some students, so she said, here's the other side of it. I've offered to mentor the students, but then they seem to pull away. So do we have students who feel they can't contact us? They cannot contact us at all?
I would assume so. I think having boundaries goes both ways. And you never know what their social situation is. It may be his own personality that you know, this is the relationship I want to have and nothing more, or they may have a partner who's in the picture who's very possessive or jealous. There's a lot that goes on in humans' lives, but I think it's okay for us to offer them mentorship, and if they're not comfortable, that's okay. We let them know we're there for them if they should change their mind. Okay. So to talk about different platforms, I know a couple of people mentioned LinkedIn. Trevor mentioned the psychology group, which ours functions primarily through LinkedIn, and then we also have a Facebook page for the college, which is separate from our personal pages. And I know a number of different programs have Facebook pages as well for their students, and probably LinkedIn as well. But as you see, and I didn't even have room to put all of the different ones, icons of all of the different ones on the screen, but there are a number of different ways that students could potentially interact with us. So is LinkedIn kind of the popular way if you do interact with students, or are there other ones besides LinkedIn and Facebook that you use? Like for me, I have joined the college Facebook group, but I created a separate Facebook profile, not my typical Facebook profile, even though my typical Facebook profile really doesn't have a lot on there, but it does have, you know, friends that are like relatives and stuff that I keep, that, which is the main reason I keep separate. You know, I don't have a lot of drama on any of my Facebook pages, but it's more not like about not giving them access to the other friends for me. So Pamela says, I don't connect via social media at all. Okay. Alice says there's a Facebook page. Okay. Not something I often do, but wonder if it's good to join and appear open, but just keep the boundaries. Yeah, and I do know people who do join college-oriented Facebook type pages from their personal accounts, and you certainly can do that. And even when you set you all probably know on your regular Facebook account, you can make your friends private to some extent. When you share posts, you know, you can. Okay, Janine also uses LinkedIn. Okay, cool. So I don't see a lot beyond Facebook and LinkedIn. Now, I know a number of faculty, just for ease of providing students access to videos that they create, you know, will use YouTube as a platform. And YouTube does have a messaging feature where you can message the person who creates the video. And so just as a reminder, if you do put videos out there, YouTube is also always linked to an email address. And so you may or may not want to make sure you have a separate Gmail account just for YouTube videos that you're going to use with students, as opposed to YouTube videos that you might put out there just in general, because again, the message will go to be connected to one particular Gmail account. Just something to think about. Okay, so I'm going to advance. I think we've kind of touched on this one already in the chat, but feel free to add the why or why not if you'd like to. And I think we've kind of touched on that. So we have all of these platforms though for, now we have Zoom, but you know, not everyone has Zoom. And so before, you know, some use Facebook messaging, Google Hangouts, Google Plus, other ways to chat. So if you use any of those, tell us about that, and then Trevor will kind of lead us into the next topic.
Yeah, and one thing I'll mention here, and this came up in conversation with Dr. Kerwin, who's not able to be with us today, but around this question in terms of conversation, I was talking about, you know, certain groups seem to prefer text over email. And, you know, I know there are features in some grading platforms, I'm not sure about Canvas, where students could opt to receive a text message about a grading update or that kind of thing. I know we have an app with Canvas, right, where students can text a message and we get the alert on our phone. And I really like that. When I was teaching, it allowed me to respond quickly and this kind of thing. My wife said, turn it off, especially in the evening. But I liked it because I could respond right away. But then Dr. Kerwin brought up a point about, some people prefer Snapchat versus text. I always kind of considered Snapchat the same as texting, just on this different kind of platform, but it is different. And so, and I do not use Snapchat to communicate with students at all, or anyone else. I see some, Yolanda, I don't know if you have comments on that, but.
Oh, no, I don't use Snapchat either for that purpose. Alice did mention that she says, I belong to a counselor education listserv and do not think about the fact that the expectation is to be a peer. What are the thoughts of being on the professional platforms and how to keep boundaries with this platform? And that is a great question. We hadn't talked about that. I hadn't thought about it. I remember when I was in grad school, we were definitely on the same platforms as our instructors. But I guess my main thought is on those platforms, the topic is strictly professional, or should be. So I personally wouldn't have a problem with that. And the listserv is set up correctly. If you reply to the listserv, people wouldn't have access to your personal email address. But feel free for anyone else to share. Yeah, so true, Alice. She said it should be professional, but well, and I guess a potential risk would be if someone is responding in an unprofessional way to the listserv, then you might have, if you read what they post, you might have some knowledge that could potentially bias. We might have now some knowledge that could potentially bias us that we'd have to, just be kind of introspective about and check on. But if you got a specific example without, being so specific that, it would embarrass anybody, please feel free to share it. And again, we're going to save some time at the end for people to unmic and share if that would be easier as well. Trevor?
So up next, different disciplines and varied perspectives. In your opinion, what constitutes having a friendship with a student that extends beyond a professional academic relationship? Anybody have thoughts on that?
Okay, so I don't know if you can see Pamela sharing something here. She had a student text her a picture of her dog on her Ashford phone. Pamela emailed her and asked her not to text her on her work phone. And of course, she didn't have her personal phone and she didn't give it to her. Pamela says, I prefer to communicate with her by school email about the things related to her schoolwork. Yeah. Stephanie says, I think self-disclosure on the part of the professional to the student constitutes a friendship. Oh, I like that. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. So Steph, how does that work in the classroom when we're maybe sharing? Again, is it all about the content or the context? I mean, where we might share something to find a common ground, then to elaborate on whatever the topic is, to take it different? I mean, or?
Yeah, so I'm guessing it depends on what's being disclosed, because, a lot of people disclose, their marital status, how many children they have, dogs and stuff like that. And then there's other, the life happens stuff that happens to humans that we could disclose. And I think that's when, for me, that's when we're getting closer to crossing the line.
Yeah. Because
part of that is just socialization. That's not even just academic bias. I was just kind of raised that you don't dump your problems onto your students or your children, or that there's a relationship of who has a responsibility to kind of and where you take your problems to.
Yeah. And Wendy, I agree with you. I prefer some type of communication that's going to allow for, a trail, if you will, be that the messaging through the Canvas app, like in our particular instance, or email or Civitas, something like that.
So Alice talks about this self-disclosing about professional experiences, how it feels to experience certain events. I think that's actually can be very educational because they may have similar experiences.
Pamela Murphy puts a comment right above that. And I noticed in the end, like, she has established rapport. She may even offer to pray with the student as well as offering an extension or something like that. I'm sure everybody has their own thoughts, about that, but I think that speaks to, Pamela having a rapport with the student and knowing where that's okay and where to offer it and where not to, right?
Now you made an interesting change of word there. And so I would like clarification. If you said she offers to pray with a student, she wrote offer to pray for a student. And that's a different kind of relationship. So I assume she's put for because she meant for, but that does.
Yeah, maybe so. Pamela, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that. Right. So there you go. I think that's a good point, Yolanda. Yeah, offer to pray for them on her own or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you may not want to respond at all, Pamela, and just leave it to Yolanda and I to chat about.
But I would assume that praying with is a different kind of relationship, in my mind at least, than praying.
Yeah. I think you're right.
And I know even when we go back to thinking about therapeutic relationships, it was more likely, if a client were to say they wanted to pray or something, typically, if the rapport was there, you would allow the client to lead. I've never been in a situation around that with a student. But I will say, if they disclose something that, I'm thinking of, if I haven't heard back from them and they say they're going through something, I might send a note thinking about you, sending positive thoughts your way or something. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help you.
Yeah. And the thing about, really, I do think the key there, at least for me, is, and I'm glad this point came up, is we just, spirituality, religion, prayer, all of those things can be very personal. And we often don't see any negative, but there could be negative experiences. And so I think rapport is the key to know when to offer that or to not. For example, a negative could be, someone like what might be a negative around prayer, right? I don't see any negative around prayer. But what if their spouse had locked them in a closet and made them pray? That's a type of abuse. And so to mention prayer could be, could bring that back up, all of this host of feelings or these kinds of things. And so I think that's where, and that could be true of a lot of things, right? If I were a particular type of cologne in the classroom of students and someone's abusive spouse used to wear that could trigger that. So, there's all kinds of things, but I think rapport, just knowing that is important.
Yeah. And many of our students are very open about their faith, and not all, but many are. In their first introduction, they'll say things. Now, Bonita mentions that she prays for her faculty all the time, and certainly those who have the spiritual beliefs can pray, and you don't have to advertise it to people that I'm praying for you. That's another thing that many people do. And then if a student mentions their faith, then we have the option to either pray for them, as Pamela mentioned, after they share something or not. I've noticed an increased diversity of student religious beliefs and backgrounds in my class. Hopefully that's attributed to the fact that I have a welcoming announcement that communicates respect for people in general and large types of diversity. And so I do see a lot of students disclosing different religions in my class. Okay.
And Pamela, I did see your response. Thank you for that. And I took it probably in a little bit different direction, but I just, I wanted to just pick up on that for the sake of conversation. Go ahead, Yolanda.
Okay, so any success stories or horror stories? I know Trevor has one or more. And so Trevor, if you want to share what you shared with us about this, and I'll glance over the chat.
Sure. So the one was just, again, offering to mentor, help, and support the student, and it really started going in this different direction. And I really hated that because I felt like the student, did not have other people in the corner to try to support them, and was trying to do that. But then I just really had to hit pause and loop in the appropriate people to let them know and to try to find other support. And I think that was hard for that student, but I felt like it was, necessary. And I'm just glad that I was able to pick up on that, ahead of time and kind of hit pause on that. I see Stephanie came on camera, so she might have something she wants to share. Go ahead, Steph.
No, I just figured we were at the talking time, so I could.
Okay. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Good. Yeah.
I do think there's a big difference, or I've noticed a difference when I was teaching lecture courses face to face. I think I struggled a little bit more with that boundary because, students would hang out after class and then walk to your office and then they'd sit and park themselves, and it was a whole lot easier for them to dump everything out there and, share. I thought this was actually a positive thing. I had a student once who I didn't know who it was, but he worked at Sonic and knew how much I loved Sonic and left like a Sonic drink on my desk before night class every week. I didn't know who was leaving it, and I very foolishly drank it every time. But at the end of the semester, he told me it had been him, and I thought, that's probably, I think I'd probably drink it again, but Sonic wins out.
Well, the fact that you didn't know, it couldn't have created a bias.
Yes, that is true. And that was thoughtful on his part to do it that way, because if he had told me, then I suppose I would have had to have asked him not to, or I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Let me share one quick success story too. I see Pamela's come on as well. She may want to share. But so a success story, I had a student in a class, and I really had not had any interaction outside of class with him. And so I didn't know this, but we were doing some group work. Obviously, this wasn't, I don't know if it's obvious or not, but it was not at Ashford. But so I assigned this guy as a leader of one of the groups, and really just because he had been active in class and this kind of thing. And afterward, come to find out, he sent me a LinkedIn request, actually wrote a letter to the dean, and said, nobody has ever expressed confidence in me until Dr. Belcher asked me to serve as a lead for this particular group. Anyway, the guy attributed that one thing to getting a promotion to an assistant manager, and it gave him this whole confidence level, and you could see that. And I'm still friends with him to this day on LinkedIn. You can see it in his posts and the way he says things. There was just such a difference before and after. It's a little different than this because it's not a Facebook or LinkedIn thing necessarily, but it is kind of a success story where that interaction made a difference. And so I don't know, thought I'd share. Go ahead, Pamela.
Okay. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was just thinking about, I write recommendation letters for students who have done really well in my classes. And so there was this one student who she was just really, really good. She did a great job on discussions and assignments and everything. And she was in the 2 undergrad classes that I teach. And in both cases, she had the highest score of everybody in whatever class she was in. So later on, she was applying to graduate schools, and she asked me to write recommendations. It turns out she was applying to a lot of schools. I wrote a lot of letters. And then she sent me by email. It was a gift card for Starbucks, $100 gift card for Starbucks. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, I know where a Starbucks is in DC, but I don't get out of the house that much. So, and I don't really like Starbucks, but I thanked her. But I don't know. I guess, yeah, she's working on a doctorate somewhere now. And I'm really proud of her. But, you know, it's just funny to me because the only contact I've ever had with her is in my class, the emails when she's, you know, telling me what's going on with her academic progression and requesting recommendation letters. So I don't know. I wonder if, see, I kind of interpret that as a social thing because it's outside of the classroom, some of it. But I don't have any students that that call me by my first name, or, you know, anything like that. And I have rarely met my students in person. There are a handful of students who live in the DC area, and after they have been in my class, if, you know, they have been nice to me in the class, we might meet somewhere for coffee, you know, like once in a lifetime, or at the Ashford events in the local area. That's usually where I see people, if I see them, other than at graduation, which I don't always get to make it across the country for that. But so the question was, do you have any success or horror stories? Mm-hmm. I don't really have any horror stories. I think there's some success stories. Okay.
Thank you, Pamela. Okay, well, what about policies related to the topic? Do you think institutions should have formal policies related to having multiple relationships with students, or do you think it's best not to have a policy and leave it to the individual decision or choice of the faculty member? Because it's, again, as I mentioned earlier, we do know, many of us know of cases where faculty members have had very close relationships, even intimate relationships with students. Not necessarily here, but. So policies, yay or nay, and now. Okay. Oops.
I think a lot of us want those policies. It helps to guide us right, and keeps some of those, clarify some of those blurred lines at times, or at least it's helpful for me in that way. Peter, thank you for the comments, man, in the chat. I know I saw him go by there. I tried to respond, but just wanted to note that. I know we're running tight on time. But we want to go to that next slide, Yolanda, and I see Alice has got something in the chat there.
Okay, yeah, I was about to respond to Alice's. I'll go ahead and progress the slide if you want to. So basically this was more where we are now. So just any additional thoughts people wanted to share. So we're pretty much right on time. Oops, I was trying to scroll to the chat. Oh, the question of first names. Is it too familiar? I think that's an individual thing. I know in graduate school, we refer to all of our faculty members by their first names, except for one. One required us. And, you know, that was fine. We respected that. And as an undergraduate, I can't think of any instructor that introduced herself or himself by their first name. I request that my students refer to me as Dr. Harper in the classroom. And if they slip, I just remind them. And then usually they say, oh, I'm sorry. I'm like, no. If I run into you in Whole Foods, which I probably won't, but you know, someplace outside of the class, after the class is over, it's Yolanda. just in the classroom at this time, it's Dr. Harper. But I don't think there's a right or wrong. I think it's just a personal comfort level. And for me, it's more of an educational opportunity for those. If I introduce myself as Dr. Harper and then they find my name, just a reminder that, you know, in other social interactions, you might want to pay attention to how people introduce themselves and take that as the lead.
Yeah, and the other side of that, Alice, for me, and Yolanda and I've talked about this together before, I will let students call me Trevor. In fact, I'll say, call me Trevor. Even though it says Joseph, I'll say, call me Trevor. She and I have talked about that before, because I get on this continuum where I feel like I'm maybe too lax, and then I'll go the other way and I'll be like too, and sometimes it's hard to just maintain the balance in terms of not just Trevor, but right, like, you know, the approach or the style on the discussion boards and the grading, how we're viewing the rubric, the level of class, all of that kind of stuff. Am I helping them move forward? Am I, you know, encouraging the behavior? Am I, you know, whatever.
Alice, just checking in on the other part of what she said. I feel that there should be a policy to set up boundaries to protect the student, faculty, and the university. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I read earlier, I think it was Stephanie, to say if there are policies and, you know, faculty or anybody's going to get in trouble, then we should know what they are. So communication, I think, is important.
You know, and Stephanie mentioned something earlier about, you know, she enjoyed the times where she got to hang out with her professors, yeah, in a campus environment, and they were really valuable. And, you know, I think if there are opportunities for us to create that moving forward, like brown bag lunches or something where students could pop in and, you know, a virtual brown bag, if you will, and chat, but we keep it professional, keep it, you know, focused on the discipline, that kind of thing. I could see it being very valuable, just like the psychology club events or the TAL Honor Society events, those kind of things. So,
yeah, and I will say also, someone mentioned, who is this? Pamela mentioned about having more informal relationships with her graduate faculty, and I know we definitely did in our graduate program. And I didn't have really informal relationships as an undergraduate. Most of my classes were huge anyway as an undergraduate, but and I do know some students did have more personal relationships with the faculty, some of the faculty at the undergraduate. But I think online is riskier. So I wouldn't have the kind of conversations that I had even with my graduate faculty, or that I observed happening with my graduate faculty in an online only environment. Even though even those conversations in my mind, didn't cross any line. They weren't super, super personal, but, you know, we knew more about which faculty was, faculty. I'm thinking of one mentor now who would share about the marital problems he was having with his wife at the time. Nothing beyond the sharing really occurred in the conversation, but still, I would see that in an online environment much more riskier.
Super presentation. Yolanda and Trevor, thank you. I believe you challenged us to find effective ways to connect with our students as friends and mentors within boundaries, of course. And, you know, just to ensure that our students are successful in the classroom. So again, thank you for your presentation, and thank you to those for attending and participating in the chat and getting some engaging conversations going on. So enjoy the rest of TLC.
Yes, thank you everyone.
Thanks everybody.